Good evening. I think I'll do that. That'll be better. So first of all, thank you for inviting me back. I'm delighted to be here. I was here 2 years ago when we were talking about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And I apologize. I have a slight cold, so I hope that you can hear me all the way in the back there. And that film was wonderful. This is an extraordinary moment for B'nai B'rith, 170 years. I really can't think of very many other organizations that can say they're 170 years old. We know that in 1843, a number of Jewish men, most of them immigrants from German-speaking lands, who had been living in New York for quite some time, where they were members of Congregation Anshe Chesed, and they were also successful businessmen. And that this was the group that founded B'nai B'rith. And I should tell you that successful businessmen for the 19th century meant that one of them was a blacksmith, one of them was a goldsmith, one of them was a paper manufacturer. So the question is, why? Why in 1843 did they decide that they needed to found this organization? The precipitating event was the fact that a number of these men had applied to join the independent lodge of the Odd Fellows. I don't know why they have that name, Odd Fellows, but that's what they were called. It was a global fraternal organization founded in England in the 18th century, and it was transplanted to America in 1819. There had been Jewish members of the Odd Fellows, but the men whose applications were rejected from the Odd Fellows were told that they should create a separate Odd Fellows Lodge, a Jewish Odd Fellows Lodge. And you could say maybe this was anti-Semitism, but in all likelihood, other immigrant groups, other ethnic groups were also being told to do exactly the same thing, have an Irish Odd Fellows Lodge, or a Scandinavian Odd Fellows Lodge. So why shouldn't there be a Jewish Odd Fellows Lodge? But the men decided they did not want to do that. That instead what they would do was they would create their own independent Jewish fellowship order in the United States, and that it would link its rituals to Jewish tradition. So we heard about the menorah lighting tonight is 100 years old, but there were other rituals that the men of B'nai B'rith established, and they were based on Jewish tradition. And that this Jewish fellowship organization, what it would do in America was to promote the mission of Israel, of the people of Israel in the United States at that point, and then eventually, as we have seen, and so many of you tonight reflect this, all around the world. So as we remember 170 years of B'nai B'rith, we should also remember that those of us here tonight who are Americans know that we are also in the midst of a major national celebration. Celebration is probably not the right word. Commemoration of 150 years since the Civil War. And you would, if you spent any time in the United States recently, those of you who are from abroad, you would see this in some, oh, thank you. I have some hot water also, thanks. Okay. So you'd see this. I mean, the Washington Post has special sections, there are commemorations at the various battlefields. America is grappling with the memory of the bloodiest war ever fought on American soil. So for those of you who come from Milan and from Montevideo, I'm going to share with you a little bit about American Jews and members of B'nai B'rith involvements in the Civil War. I want to link the two commemorations. So, and it gives me a kind of framework, because I've been given about 20 minutes, and I can't do 170 years of history in 20 minutes. Although your film did it in 6.5. So, for her important history, the independent orders of B'nai B'rith and True Sisters, pioneers of a new Jewish identity, the German scholar Cornelia Wilhelm mined the B'nai B'rith archives, which then were located in Washington, D.C., and are now safely housed at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, and that's thanks to your great perspicacity and recognition of the centrality of these documents to the history, not just of America's Jews, but to the history of Jews all over the world. And I see that you're going to have a webinar with Gary Zola at the American Jewish Archives in December, so I encourage you to take advantage of that, where you'll be able to see on your computer screens some of these original documents. So Professor Wilhelm was one of the first scholars to work in these archives, and she taught us a great deal about the history, the early history of B'nai B'rith. By 1855, just 6 years before the war broke out, the association had lodges spread all across the United States. The momentum that carried the men of B'nai B'rith forward had spurred their wives and their sisters and their daughters to create the first nationwide Jewish women's organization, the Independent Order of True Sisters, founded in 1846. We also know a great deal about how much the leadership of the Independent Order of B'nai B'rith overlapped with the men leading America's congregations back then, the rabbis and the laymen. So these records shed some light also on the great issues that were dividing Americans back then, namely slavery and the Civil War. Slavery and the Civil War divided the nation. It divided America's Jews. It did not divide B'nai B'rith. Not surprisingly, for a young organization, not even 2 decades old, the leadership then made a very smart decision that they would not take a political stance during the war, because had they done so, they would have alienated chapters and on the other side of wherever they stood. Nevertheless, B'nai B'rith members and lodges were involved in some of the war's most dramatic developments affecting America's Jews. So before I turn to these, let me remind you of what the American Jewish community looked like in 1860. And for some of you, this might be the first time you actually hear about this. We don't have any data for 1860 the way we have now in 2013, the new Pew demographic study that tells us more than we could ever possibly want to know about America's Jews. So we have kind of guesses. In 1860, there were probably 150,000 Jews in the United States. Jews were less than 0.5%. So we're talking about a tiny, tiny community. And in some places where they lived, there were just a few Jews living in a particular town. Most of them were recent immigrants or the children of immigrants. And that means they came from some of the European countries that those of you here tonight represent. Mostly they came from German-speaking countries, but not exclusively. Most of America's Jews lived in the north, but there were important Jewish communities in the south. And as we would expect, the question of slavery divided America's Jews. So I want to give you insight into one particular case. 2 rabbis, 1861. They had a famous debate over whether the Bible permitted slavery. So Rabbi Morris Rafal lived in New York, and even though he said, quote, he was no friend to slavery in the abstract and still less friendly to the practical working of slavery, but as a teacher in Israel, propounding the word of God, when he was asked, does the Bible permit slavery? He had to answer yes. We all know slavery appears in the Bible, and it's not just that the Jews get out of Egypt and are freed from slavery. If you go a couple of chapters later and you get to the Parsha Mishpatim, you'll see right away that there's all sorts of laws about how the Israelites are supposed to treat their slaves. There's not a single one of the 613 commandments that prohibits slave owning. In response, an outraged Baltimore rabbi named David Einhorn, who was not a member of B'nai B'rith, but had many B'nai B'rith members in his congregation, wrote, to proclaim in the name of Judaism that God has consecrated the institution of slavery, Such a shame and reproach the Jewish religious press is in duty bound to disown and disavow if both are not to be stigmatized forever. The upshot for Rabbi Einhorn, after he gave an anti-slavery sermon in a congregation in Baltimore, a southern city that was segregated into the 1960s, a mob formed outside to tar and feather him. He fled for his life to Philadelphia. When the war finally broke out, Jewish men, North and South, enlisted. About 10,000 Jews fought in the Civil War, probably 2,000 to 3,000 of them for the South. 6 Northern Jews received this country's highest honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military award that we have in this nation. By the way, the only reason we even know this information is because it comes from a book by Simon Wolf. It's called The American Jews as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. And you should know that Simon Wolf was your international president from 1904 to 1905. We also know that as men went off to war, they left behind wives, mothers, and daughters who sustained in their way women's cause. One of the paramount stories of the war for Americans and for American Jews was how it divided their families. It didn't just divide B'nai B'rith, it actually broke down in family units. So in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Julius Ox, who was the father of the future New York Times publisher Adolph Ox, Julius Ox joined the Union Army. His wife, Bertha, became a charter member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. At her funeral, there was a Confederate flag on her coffin. At his, the Stars and Stripes. This war also ignited religious passions in both the North and the South. Some were fired by visions of millenarianism, that we were at a moment in the United States where the world was going to be totally transformed, and that it was America's failure to live up to its Christian mission that had brought about the war. So shortly after Lincoln's election, a constitutional amendment acknowledging the authority of Jesus Christ and the recognition of divine law was introduced into Congress. Now, we all know it never passed, but its introduction tells us so much about that Christian nature of the United States back in the 19th century when B'nai B'rith was organizing in its lodges for its Jewish identity. This was a country which had blue laws, so that Jews and Christians couldn't do certain things on Sundays. It had New Testament readings in its public schools. The result of this Christian thrust was that Jewish difference was heightened during the Civil War. Jewish women who fled war zones and took refuge with their Christian friends wrote of how they had to hide their Jewish identities. They would write this in their diaries because they were living in Christian households. Jewish difference was also highlighted in the American military. And I want to talk about 2 cases where we see B'nai B'rith being active and 2 cases that advance Jewish rights in America during the Civil War. We know America is a deeply religious nation. In 1775, the Continental Congress enacted a provision to pay for army chaplains. Until the Civil War, those chaplains were always Protestants. The Confederacy immediately established a chaplaincy. Because it stipulated that only clergymen could serve, there seems to have been no legal barrier to Jews serving. But with only 2,000 to 3,000 Jews in the Confederacy, in the Confederate Army, it doesn't seem likely that there was a Jewish chaplain. But in the North, the United States Congress had ruled that chaplains had to be regularly ordained ministers of some Christian denomination. When the law passed, the pioneer of Reform Judaism, Isaac Mayer Wise, who happened to have held a high position in B'nai B'rith in Cincinnati, recognized this as a violation of our constitutional rights. But Wise didn't move forward to challenge the law. Instead, others did. In September 1861, a YMCA, that's the Young Men's Christian Association, a worker for the YMCA, was visiting a military camp in Virginia and found out that one Michael Allen, and I don't know if he belonged to B'nai B'rith, but Michael Allen was a Philadelphia Jew, and he was serving as chaplain in the regiment of Colonel Max Friedman, and a regiment that happened to have had a lot of Jewish men in it. The YMCA worker was so outraged that he demanded that Allen be discharged dishonorably and without pay. Allen was humiliated. He was obviously not a member of a Christian denomination, and he was also not an ordained clergyman, so he resigned. But Colonel Friedman wanted to push the case forward, and Colonel Friedman demanded that the Congress then consider appointing Reverend, is kind of a word for rabbi in the 19th century, Arnold Fischel. When the Secretary of War said Fischel could not be a chaplain because he didn't meet the test of a Christian denomination, it became abundantly clear that this was the first instance of outright discrimination and legal inequity for Jews at the federal level in this nation's history. So lobbying, surely some of it by men from B'nai B'rith, led Congress to amend the law a year later so that a regularly ordained minister of some religious denomination could serve as chaplain. So here we see, as we have seen so many times throughout B'nai B'rith's history, America's Jews opening doors for themselves, but also for other religious groups. The other episode seared into Jewish memory is, of course, Ulysses S. Grant's General Orders Number 11, the most sweeping anti-Jewish regulation in all of American history. And I'll take the next little bit of remarks from Jonathan Sarna. You just saw him in the film. His fine book, When General Grant Expelled the Jews. So from his headquarters in Holly Springs, Mississippi, in the Department of Tennessee, on December 17, 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant expelled the Jews as a class from the territory under his command. Now you have to understand what expulsion means in terms of Jewish memory. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, from the German states over the 14th and 15th centuries, and most especially from Spain in 1492. Expulsion, kicking the Jews out, is something that didn't happen in America. It was the fate of European Jewry. Jews were given 24 hours to pack their bags. When Prussian-born Caesar Kaskel, who had journeyed to America in the 1850s, heard and received his notice of expulsion in Paducah, Kentucky, he decided he was going to fight the order. I should add, relatively few Jews were expelled because there had been a battle and the Confederate armies had torn up about 50 miles of telegraph lines that Grant would have used. But Kaskel said he was going to go to the top, and he immediately sent a telegram to Lincoln. Lincoln probably never saw that telegram. It was December 1862. Lincoln was preparing to issue the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. So Kaskel set off for Washington, and on his way, he told everybody he met, including the men of B'nai B'rith, about what had happened. And B'nai B'rith geared up. The eloquent plea from the Missouri lodges to President Lincoln has survived. It insisted that Jews were a class of loyal citizens who had been driven from their homes and deprived of their liberty. It commended these Jews who were sacrificing their lives and fortunes for the Union and the suppression of the rebellion. The letter was signed by President Harry Cutner and Secretary Harris Hoffman, and it asked the president to annul that order and protect the liberties of even your humblest constituents. Even before the letter could have been mailed, Lincoln had already done that, but the Missouri lodges did not know. On January 3rd, 1863, Caskill had an audience with Lincoln. This is Caskill's version of the story of what they said there. It's probably amplified a bit. Lincoln, and so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan. Caskill, yes, and that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom, asking protection. Lincoln, and this protection they shall have at once. Lincoln countermanded the order. He sent it to his general-in-chief of the army, and this, the most infamous episode of governmental prejudice in all of American Jewish history, was at an end. Would it herald these two cases, the chaplaincy and countermanding the expulsion, would these herald the Jewish life in America would be different? I think 170 years of B'nai B'rith's history proves that. Let me give you just 3 examples from kind of moving forward. In the 1870s, concerned over Romania's state-sponsored anti-Semitism, B'nai B'rith appealed to President Ulysses S. Grant to intervene. Grant's response, he dispatched B'nai B'rith member Benjamin Franklin Peixoto as U.S. consul to Romania. In 1945, B'nai B'rith President Henry Monsky led an international delegation of leaders to San Francisco, where they founded the United Nations. In the 1960s, B'nai B'rith President Label Katz met not with one, but with 2 popes and helped spark the dialogue which led to Vatican II's famed encyclical Nostra Aetate, which after 2,000 years of calumny absolved Jews of collective responsibility for Jesus' death. I could go on and on. There are 170 years to talk about, and the accomplishments of B'nai B'rith on the national and international scene would take us far into the night. If the past is prologue, I know this will continue to march. This wonderful organization will march from here on forward for the next 170 years, from strength to strength into the future. Thank you.